So, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Giuseppe Abbamonte. I am the Director for Media at DigiConnect, for Media and Copyright at DigiConnect at the European Commission. There is a technical brief. I will speak shortly, but try and be as short as possible about the copyright reform. I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience, so I will try to be really as to the point as possible, and then I will have the honor to give the floor to Ms. Comodini Cachia from the European Parliament. And we have only 45 minutes, so there will be some time possibly for questions after the two interventions. So the starting point, which is the Bible for the people working at DigiConnect, is the digital single market. The digital single market, as you are well aware, is one of the priorities of the Juncker's Commission, one of the political priorities and policy priorities of the Juncker's Commission. The strategy, which was adopted last year, rests on three pillars. So the first pillar is better access for consumers and business to digital goods and services across Europe. The second pillar is the creation of the right framework conditions for digital networks and services to flourish. And the third is the maximization of the growth potential of the digital economy, and notably the big data, high-performance computing, and cloud computing, which are regarded as drivers for growth, jobs, and prosperity in Europe. Now, the good thing about the copyright reform is that it is really transversal because it cuts across the three pillars. I mean, the copyright reform, as we will see in a second, guarantees better access to protected material for consumers and business, creates the right conditions for the digital networks and services to flourish. So it goes hand in hand, for example, with the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, and it's very important for maximizing the growth potential of the digital economy. Well, the first thing which comes to my mind is the text and data mining exception, which is really key, which is at the heart of the big data economy. So the copyright reform, what is the background? There was a communication of December of last year where the Commission sketched out a long-term vision for the reform of the copyright framework, and then announced a number of targeted actions. The most important of this action at the time was the proposal for a regulation on cross-border portability of online content and services. Well, you are all too familiar with the regulation. Consumers are empowered. So if consumers, for example, subscribe to a video-on-demand service or a streaming service in one country, in the country of residence of the consumer will be able to circulate in temporarily, of course, across Europe and enjoy the same services. So, for example, watch films that he has downloaded at home. The second copyright package, which is the subject matter of today's presentation, has just been adopted. It was adopted on the 14th of September. It consists of 4 legislative proposals and an accompanying communication. There is a regulation on online transmission and retransmissions of TV and radio programs, a directive on copyright on the digital single market, which regulates, amongst other things, the exceptions, the value gap, and the new publishers-related right, and something which is very important, which has been a little, unfortunately, overlooked by the press, the implementation of the Marrakesh Treaty for people with print disability, with visual disabilities, for the blinds and people with visual disabilities, through a directive and a regulation. And I've just been told that the Marrakesh Treaty will be enacted tomorrow, so will come into force tomorrow amongst the signatories of the treaty. Yes, so what are the main objectives of the reform? The first is the facilitation of cross-border access to protected material and protected content online. The second objective is the modernization of the EU rules on key exceptions and limitations in the areas of research, education, and preservation of cultural heritage. One of the leitmotifs of the strategy, of the DSM strategy, is to make sure that the framework, the copyright framework and the audiovisual media framework are fit for purpose in the digital age. And then the last objective is basically introducing fairer rules of the game for a better functioning of the copyright marketplace. So fair rules of the game, what does it mean? It means that the value which is generated through the distribution the distribution of protected material online is shared more equally amongst the different stakeholders. So I will say a few words now about the regulation. So the regulation, one of the first measures of the regulation, which represents a little bit an extension of the Satellite and Cable Directive, is the facilitation of transmission of TV and radio programs online across border for services which are ancillary to initial broadcasting, so simulcasting and catch-up TV. And for these services and for the clearing of the rights, of the copyrights which relate to these services, there will be an application of the country of origin. Where yesterday there was a very lively debate on this particular issue, but I think that, well, at least I believe that the application of the country of origin brings about a lot of certainty, brings about a lot of legal certainty, reduces significantly compliance cost, because it will allow people who want to use these contents, in particular broadcasters, to comply only with one set of rules instead of 28 different sets of rules. So I think that is a very important, very important element of the proposal, and also something which goes hand in hand with the approach taken in the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, which rests, which is the sister, if you want, directive, and which rests on the country of origin. The second proposal is the retransmission, so it's the facilitation of retransmission of TV and radio, so by means other than cable, but which are akin to cable. So in particular, through satellite, IPTV, mobile networks, but over closed networks. So OTT retransmission, so retransmission over the internet, is not covered by the proposal. And in this case, so along the same lines of the SATCAP directive, we have introduced a mandatory collective management of rights for, and it is important, for defined number of users. So something which is important and which is part of this pillar about the facilitation of cross-border access to content online is the measures, so the mechanism to facilitate the licensing of European films on VOD platforms. So for these, in the communication, we have announced the creation of an EU stakeholder structured dialogue which will aim at creating a general framework conditions and eventually standard contract terms, which is going to make licensing much easier for the platforms. And also something which has been a bit royally overlooked by everybody are the additional measures, the accompanying measures, which are contained in the media part of the Creative Europe program. So the media program, which has been transferred from DG ERC to DG Connect, sits at the very heart also of the DSM strategy. And the aim of the program is really to facilitate the emergence of the legal offer. And how? By making, once again, the clearance of the rights and the life of the VOD providers and the broadcasters in general much easier. How? Through the ready-to-offer catalogs and the licensing hubs, and also through the subsidies which are given to dubbing and subtitling. So the new copyright exceptions. There is currently a lot of legal uncertainties on acts, so copyright-related acts which are allowed in the digital environment. So the first exception, which is the exception for illustration for teaching purposes, teachers and students face uncertainty for the users in teaching practices, in particular in a cross-border environment. So what we do, we have introduced a number of mandatory exceptions covering, for example, digital and online uses across border, which the member states may make subject to the availability of licenses at national level. This is going to make really the life of the educational establishments and professors also much easier if, for example, they want to offer their teaching services on a website which may be accessed from everywhere across Europe, or, for example, if a professor in Bologna wants to go to Vienna and use his teaching material online. Another very important, and so this is something which really shows the citizenship dimension, the consumer dimension of the reform. So the benefits, the concrete benefits that will be brought about by the reforms for citizens in particular. Another very important exception is the exception for text and data mining. So another mandatory exception, which will allow research organizations to use new automatic technologies to analyze large data sets of data for scientific purposes in all legal certainty. And something which is important, which has been a little overlooked, is the fact that the research may be carried out also for commercial purposes within a PPP. So the exception will not apply to research which is carried out in-house by a company in order to commercialize a prototype which is very, very close to the market, but will certainly will certainly apply to research to be carried out within a public-private partnership, where the research is really very often motivated by commercial reasons. Another important exception is the one for preservation reasons, which will allow cultural heritage institutions to make copies, including digital copies, of protected works for preservation purposes. And finally, there is the exception which is set out in the directive implementing the Marrakesh Treaty, which will allow the authorized institution to make, to create copies, so formats, which will allow the visually impaired peoples, the blinds, for example, to read books. And something which is very, very important, the exception will also allow, so as a result of the regulation, these institutions will be able to share the formatted books also with third countries who have signed the convention. Yes. So there is one of the main pillars of the reform, and the one which has attracted the greater attention from the press, and which is, I would say, which has raised the most controversy. And so with these proposals, the Commission basically is embracing a vision of the digital economy, which is a fair sort of vision of the digital economy, where really the value which is generated by the reuse of protected content is distributed fairly amongst the various stakeholders. So there is a new related right for press publishers to strengthening really the bargaining powers vis-à-vis the online platforms. Well, you are familiar with the topic. Currently, film producers or record companies, they have related rights, but press publishers don't. So as a result of these related rights, press publishers, the related rights will apply to reproduction, it will apply to communication to the public, so it will apply to typical copyrights, and also will entitle, without requiring, of course, the publishers to ask for a fair remuneration for the reuse of their protected works. there are new rules, so this is the second point, which require, which establish basically a cooperation mechanism at national level between the online service providers, so the platforms, the OTT platforms, and the right holders. So basically, the online service providers will have to put in place some mechanisms, some measures which will ensure the effective implementation of the agreements, so of the licensing and other monetization, revenue sharing agreements with the right holders, and which will enable them, so the measures may include, for example, content identification technologies, will enable them to get a better understanding of what is circulating or what is being distributed over their platforms, and to avoid that unauthorized content, so pirated content, keeps circulating on the platforms. As a result of this mechanism, there will be much more transparency, and as a result of this, the right holders will be in a better position to negotiate fairer monetization and revenue sharing agreements with the platform. So this will balance out in a more fair way, if you want, the situation, resulting possibly in a better distribution of the values amongst the various actors and the various parties at stake. The last point, which is a point which has been royally overlooked by the press, and it is really a pity because it's something which should really reconnect Europe with the citizens, are the new rules on transparency for authors, so for the creators, for authors and performance, on the exploitation and remuneration of their works. So what it means is that authors and performers will be able to go to the people to whom they have entrusted their rights, and so to the publishers, for example, to the editors, and ask them how well they are doing, so how well their works are doing. Once they receive this information, they will have a right to basically get an appropriate remuneration if there is an obvious disproportion between the money they are getting and the success of their works. And something which is important, there will be a settlement, so a mechanism to settle dispute at national level. It will be a voluntary settlement mechanism, but which the member states will be required to put in place. So let me say a few words about but really a few words about the Council. So now the legislative process, the legislative machine is being set in motion. We will start the work in Council next Monday. And next Monday, we'll start discussing the directive on the Marrakesh Treaty. On Tuesday, there will be a first presentation and discussion of the directive on copyright in the digital single market. So now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Comodini, so you can tell us a little bit what are your preliminary views on the package. So what is your sentiment in the Parliament, and how, in your opinion, the matter will be taken forward in the Parliament? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abbamonte. Thank you also for the invite for this event. I have been asked to share my thoughts, but to be very honest, the procedure will start officially within the committee and within Parliament at a later day or in a few days. It hasn't started officially. So what I will share is my personal thoughts and also thoughts that I have discussed with either other colleagues, other fellow MEPs, or even feedback that has already been provided by relevant and the different stakeholders. Of course, the thoughts that I will share are, let's say, a work in progress, so that they are not to be taken as the conclusive position, but they are work in progress because part of our work as members of the European Parliament is definitely to keep an open mind and to ensure that our policy and our legislation, our proposals will effectively address what needs to be addressed. I would say that one common element that has been, one common reaction that has been brought forward and has been expressed is that the Commission has identified the areas that correctly need to be addressed, therefore that the Commission has identified the challenges that needed to be addressed. Even if some say these are modestly and not boldly addressed, but at least the areas and the challenges and barriers were correctly identified. One challenge that continuously keeps cropping up is that of freedom of panorama, and that this has been left out from the proposal. I believe this is something that we within the European Parliament will also be faced with. We seem to look at this proposal or at this challenge to bring copyright into the digital environment as being something about making sure that people can enjoy and access creative and cultural content in their digital lifestyles. It is also about facilitating the life of service providers to be able to provide access to content, but it is also about ensuring that while we enjoy and have access to content that exists, we can continue to invest in opportunities of having new content, and this by ensuring that lawful access to content, which of itself requires compensation, is also thought of. At the same time, there are public mission or public interest situations which do need to be taken into consideration. I think this is about how can we satisfy increased digital lifestyles with their demands for content and the different manners of consumption of that content. But we cannot stop at only addressing consumption patterns of content and forget about how technology and digital opportunities can help create and generate new content. Portability, addressing unjustified geo-blocking were the starting points. In addition, the exceptions for education and research, the increase in transparency for authors and creators and performers, the facilitation of licenses for service providers are also a good way forward. In the Parliament, we will have to deal with questions such as the following. Where does one reach a balance between commercial and non-commercial use for exceptions to be created? Or even, should we distinguish and treat commercial and non-commercial activities as both equally deserving the same intervention from the legislator? How far do we go towards empowering the original creator vis-à-vis others on the value chain? Are we really using the right medium to address challenges, such as in the case of related rights for press publishers? These are all questions that we are already raising ourselves and that stakeholders too are raising, and therefore these will be crucial questions for Parliament to address when making its own proposals on this Commission proposal. But if I had to look at some of the specific proposals in the Commission document, and if I had to see, for example, how the Commission has tried to address research, education, and preservation of cultural heritage, I would say that there the Commission has obtained quite a good understanding of how digital technologies give new types of uses, and that we too want to give public mission-related stakeholders the possibility to take the opportunities that are made available to them. I often think that we shouldn't look at digital technologies as enemies of copyright and right holders, nor place them to be such, simply because the digital single market needs them both. The Commission proposal does bolster legal offer of content and thus try to unlock the digital potential of making content more available. Other questions that will surely be quite hot questions to be debated in the European Parliament is where do we use or why do we use exceptions for non-commercial purposes but not for commercial purposes, especially when the digital single market is all about the unleashing of commercial growth. The TDM exception can be seen as giving a good push forward, however, for investing in early research, which is already carried out with great and severe difficulties by universities or even in public-private partnerships. Non-commercial, if you have a look at the proposals, non-commercial is not necessarily related to funding manner, nor necessarily related to the making of revenues, the generating of revenues. In fact, if we look at the education exception, it is clearly stated that the structure and funding method is not to be considered. If we look at the digitalization projects of heritage institutes, the proposal clearly states that these will continue to remain to be able to generate reasonable revenues to cover costs. So in reality, we do have to consider how to make this distinction between commercial and non-commercial uses a bit more clear. Even when we consider the TDM exception, this also includes some commercial purposes through the PPPs, but the exceptions themselves are themselves intervening in cases which are not very close to market commercialization procedures. When we look at the exception of education, I think we would all agree in this room that education is an aspect which is of European priority. We would all agree that most of our member states are trying to address not just the skills gap between that we have in e-schools, but also trying to make education possible across borders. And we have seen a number of education stakeholders who have taken up this challenge seriously. But in them taking up that challenge, they are faced with a barrier of copyright, especially when the content they would like to use to facilitate and support their teaching and learning processes face unclear or lack of clarity in copyright regulations. I think with the creation of the legal presumption that is proposed in this proposal, this should put the lack of clarity, should bring the lack of clarity at an end. I believe that the creation of this legal presumption will, in fact, provide our educators, be they public or private educators, the possibility of taking European education a step further, also across borders. If we had to look at the paragraphs, the articles which refer to on-demand services, or even the paragraphs which deal with cultural heritage institutions, I think these two show a drive forward. The drive forward to make sure that content is available. And by making content available, especially to on-demand service providers, we are at the end trying to make more content lawfully available also to the people. There is a bit of a concern that I've been hearing repeatedly in the corridors, and this concern relates to user-generated content. Of course, user-generated content cannot be stopped because it is directly an attack on digital lifestyles. There is doubt that content recognition technologies informing right holders of user-uploaded content is going to work much, considering the already immense volume of user-generated content, and that this is expected to increase. So while discussion is centered around what can we do to address the value gap, at this point it is likely to move towards whether the proposed method reaches the right balance. The transparency element being proposed for authors and performers for exploitation and remuneration of their works is certainly most welcomed, as this can help empower authors and performers and creators in a digital environment without having too much interference by the legislator. A final word on the Marrakesh Treaty. I believe everyone knows that the European Parliament has been in favor of making content, cultural and creative content, easily accessible to visually impaired persons. The Parliament has repeatedly expressed its support for the Marrakesh Treaty to become a legislative obligation also on all our member states, and therefore the Commission will find the Parliament's, I would assume, full support in this respect. I think those were just a couple of thoughts that have been running through the corridors in my mind, but also of the European Parliament. But once again, these are not conclusive thoughts. And the discussion is ongoing. The discussion has started. The discussion will continue to proceed, and we will continue to discuss all the issues that need to be discussed. Thank you.
Hello? Yeah. So we have 10 more minutes. Is there anything that you want to say?
Is there one thing?
10 minutes. Yes.
Hello? Can you hear me? Yes. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Libor Manda. I'm from Seznam.cz, Czech search engine and digital services provider. And my question is there any particular future plans, I mean regulatory ones in connection to search engines? I mean the question of snippets in general search results and so on. Because now seeing the copyright package, we are afraid that it will move to this question as well, to this issue as well.
Sorry, I didn't get the question. Can you explain it a bit better?
Yes. If you have any plans regarding the copyright issue for search engines, I mean like the issue of snippets in general search results. If you see them as a copyright issue or not.
Well, you know, well, I don't know to what extent the question is copyright relevant for the snippets. Well, there is a general reflection on the platforms, so the role of the platforms in the digital single market, and of course the search engines are part of it. Are you referring to the publishers' related right in relation to snippets? What is your concern in particular?
In general search, in the search box, if you put the keyword and then you get the result from the search, and there are also, of course, issues which are under copyright, like the snippets and parex from new services. If you consider these results, these snippets as copyright issues, so if we are about to pay for these snippets showing in general search results based on keywords we put or the users put in the search box.
Well, I mean, these are the gist of the reform. So, as I said, for the publishers' related rights, is to make sure, and it is fully in line also with the most recent case law of the Court of Justice, is to make sure that if you have a commercial website which uses basically content, so protected content of press publishers, belonging to press publishers, that the press publishers will have a say on how this content is used, and they may require a remuneration, so a fair remuneration. Now, for these snippets, I really don't know, because this will be very, very short snippets, so I don't know to what extent they are even covered by copyright. Something which I have not said, but it has been said ad nauseam and repeated ad nauseam so far, is that there will be no hyperlink tax in the reform, and that the reform in no way will, because we are not extending the scope of application of the copyright, we are not changing the exceptions under the copyright directive. So the reform will in no way undermine or affect the way, for example, individual consumers and users share hyperlinks or share information online. Would you like to chip in?
I think this is what I was going to say, that hyperlinks have been removed. I mean, it could be that some people are still thinking of the document that was leaked. But there was a change from between that document and the final document. And the final document specifically identifies hyperlinks as not being touched by this Commission proposal. But something that is a bit worrying, and I would say this is more of a concern even to the legal profession, is that when we speak of snippets and referencing and linking and making available of copyrighted content online, then even the judgments of the court could be very difficult to understand, the tests there. If your question was whether the Commission wanted to address the use of snippets online, I don't think this proposal really addresses that or affects the use of snippets in any way.
Yes, please. Can you, yeah.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel Forrest, representative of TF1, the first TV channel. I have just a naive question about the compatibility between our business model, genuine business model, and the first objective of the first item, which is to provide people with cross-border access to catch-up TV, for instance. Our business model is to sell to advertisers advertising slots. And the experience proves that these advertisers do not require, there is no demand for pan-European advertising slots. For instance, we have also in the group Bouygues Telecom. We are a French telecom operator, and they don't want to advertise in Slovakia, Poland, or anywhere. So we get money from the advertisers to buy or to produce contents for the French market, and we have not enough money to buy the rights for the whole territory of the European Union. So, in fact, when you consider the relevant market, which is the advertising market, there is no failure on the single market because there is no demand for pan-European advertising. And how would it be compatible with the fact that we should provide access to catch-up TV for content for which we didn't acquire the rights for Europe, since there was no demand for that from our clients, which is the advertiser?
I don't need it. I have the microphone. But so just maybe a clarification. The aim of the first pillar of the copyright is to ensure, which is also the first pillar of the DSM, so is to ensure that citizens and business have enhanced access across border to content. To digital services, for example, and to, in the case of copyrights, to protected content. So what we are doing, simply, we are not dictating any particular business model. I don't think that I don't think there is even an unintended consequence of our regulatory approach. What we are doing is that for the ancillary services, we are making the life of the broadcasters easier. So we are driving down their costs, and we are getting them an additional incentive on the basis of the country of origin to reach out to more people. So yesterday, for example, we had a long discussion during the panel on whether the country of origin will destroy business models of the film producers. I really don't think so. Because after all, what we are doing, more people, if the country of origins, if the mechanism works, and the same considerations are valid for collective management. If the mechanism works, it means that more people will be reached out, so more people will consume videos, this will generate more revenues, and the film producers will be, well, you may say no, but it is highly disputable. And the same thing applies to the applies to the cable-like TV services. So the clearing of the rights for the aggregation is a nightmare, is a real nightmare. So what we are trying to do is that we are trying to simplify the life of these people to the benefit really of the digital single market, because these people will be confronted with one interlocutor only and not a sort of myriad of interlocutors, which is gonna, which is a little bit the negation of the digital single market, in my opinion.
There's also a side aspect which your question has reminded me of. and that is providing access to content to minorities or to small populations. If what you're saying is, well, this all depends, access to these minorities or access to small populations, all depends on whether our advertisers want to advertise in those communities, then that raises questions of itself. So yes, I do understand that commercial entities are there to make profits and to generate revenues. But I think as policymakers, we do have to take on the general picture, especially if we are speaking of a digital single market, which should address also the cultural diversity and the linguistic diversity, of which we are so proud within the European Union.
Sorry, I encourage you to be continent because we don't have a lot of time. So I would say, what, three more questions? 3 more questions, please. Is the lady who decides.
Hi, and thanks for your answer to the TF1 question. I just have a follow-up question on that. Your answer seems to imply that the regulation is not forcing but just facilitating rights clearance for broadcasters, and that there is still contractual freedom to take into account business models, such as the advertising one that TF1 was describing. But of course, if we look at the regulation in a vacuum, that is true. But we know that at the same time, DG Comp is enforcing competition law in the same area in a way that might end up with a very limited contractual freedom to decide whether or not you will actually want to offer on a cross-border basis as a broadcaster. And I was reading the impact assessment, and there it explicitly said we are not looking at the enforcement of competition law while we're doing this impact assessment, because it is unsure what the outcome is. So we are just looking at the effects on the market, not taking into account the application of competition law. But can you really do that? Is that really realistic to look at the regulation in a vacuum like that without looking at the effects it might actually create in the wider picture of European law?
Well, you know, if the Commission had to take every imponderable also thing into account when making a proposal, the life of the European regulator would be impossible. It would be completely stifled. So we have to consider. But we have to consider that our proposal. Without speculating on what can be the result of the investigation carried out by DG Comp. So we've been, as you quite rightly say, we are not calling into question the contractual freedom of the parties. So the parties will still retain, so the right holders will still retain the possibility to withdraw the license, to renegotiate the license, to opt out. Our measure is a liberalization measure, is a measure which will drive the cost for a large chunk of the industry, and I think it's something which needs to be supported. Also, because it goes hand in hand with the other proposal, which is the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, which is based exactly on the same principles. So it cannot be that wrong after all. Sorry, there was someone else who wanted to ask for the floor. Sorry, and you wanted to say something.
Okay, thank you. My name is Ola Stockman, I'm from IFRA. And I just wanted to say first that I wanted to give credit to the Commission for the papers and the documents that they have submitted, because they are factual and they are also trying to understand, at least in our sector, and to build on and strengthen mechanisms and systems which are already in place and try to favor them. That goes for education, that goes for how the commerce works, even if there are certain things that we would also want to see differently. But I think those are nuances that we can come back to and that we can do and can discuss further later on. Among this, it's also important, one article that you didn't mention in your presentation, and that is Article 12, which guarantees that both authors and publishers can be remunerated for collective management and the collective management schemes administered by RROs, which is an important element in preserving those structures. My question is rather, and also on cross-border issues, I think that they actually go to and reflects the state of the art as they are today, actually, and they make them legal. My question is it possible for you to say a little bit more about the process? Because you were very short on the process, and especially the process that you expect in the Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you for your words of encouragement, which we need. On the process, there is a little bit of a crystal ball exercise. So meaning that feel free to compliment and then chip in any time, but basically it's the co-legislation process. So you have a lecture, you have a first reading, which is carried out simultaneously in Council and Parliament. In Council, you have a working group, which is the IP, Intellectual Property Working Group, which looks after the package. In Parliament, well, you are much better placed than me. There will be a rapporteur who will be appointed. There will be a parliamentary committee who will follow the work, will be the leading committee, and who will follow the work. And then basically the Commission will intervene as a sort of honest broker in the process, defending the proposal, of course, and try and create convergence between the positions of the two co-legislators. So if everything goes, so if we are optimistic and everything goes fine, everything will be finished off in one reading, which will culminate in a trilogue, so in a meeting which will comprise of the Parliament, the Council, and the European Commission. If not, there will be a second reading, which will take much longer.
I didn't focus on this process because it is the normal process for any Commission proposal or for most Commission proposals. The lead committee in Parliament on copyright-related issues would be the Legal Affairs Committee, of which I am a full member. And we do expect to start working on this pretty soon, at least in a formal manner. But that does not mean that our members have not already started discussing this. We've been discussing this really focused on specific measures for at least since the own initiative report that we had, I believe, last year on exactly the copyright directive itself. But otherwise, it's the normal procedure, the normal legislative procedure that is already established.
Thank you. So we already run a little bit behind schedule. What I encourage you to do is that, I am relatively new to the job, so I've taken over the file very recently, but I'm open-minded. I am now based in Brussels because I moved from Luxembourg, so you give me a ring, we fix an appointment, and you will explain, so you will provide the litany of all your arguments, and be assured that you will find a very receptive interlocutor. Would you like to say something else?
No, just thank you for everyone for your participation, and also thank you for for providing us as members of the Parliament with information on your experiences.